Welcome to the 14th part, where we're looking at the letter that Paul wrote to the Romans. We're looking at chapters 9, 10 and 11, where Paul addresses the question as to where the Jewish nation, the people of Israel, fit into God's plans. This is the second part, looking at the role and the place of the Jewish people. And we're going to focus today towards the end of chapter 9 and through to the end of chapter 10. Paul addresses two very important questions. Given the impact that Jesus made, all he achieved, why do the Jewish nation of his day and today, why do the majority reject Jesus? And in the light of that rejection, the second question is, has God just written the nation off? They've rejected Jesus, God's answer. In the last presentation, we got at least part of the answer to the first question. The Jewish nation over the years had turned the Old Testament into a kind of rule book, and they tried to win God's favour by self-effort in keeping the rules. The Pharisees were the experts at this, and they were brilliant at it. They'd set up a complete myriad and set of rules, and everyone had to keep these rules. If you kept enough rules, God would be pleased, and he'd let you into heaven. You can see the same pattern of behaviour in most religions today, but you see it very clearly in Islam. A rule book mentality. Keep the rules, do what God says, God will be pleased. This is not God's way. And indeed it's laughable. How can any of us be good enough to keep a rule book well enough to impress God, the maker of the universe? Holding the second question for the moment, in the last presentation we recognized that there were some key ideas that underpin chapters 9, 10 and 11, important ideas. God's sovereignty in the context of human free will. And this is how Paul is seeing it. God is still sovereign. His plans have not gone wrong, despite the choice of humans so often to reject them. And he's focusing here on the rejection of the Jewish people of his day of Jesus. God has a long-term plan. God has a long-term purpose for humanity. And these plans don't go wrong. But we can choose to enter these plans and become part of them, or we can choose to reject them. Human choice and free will are always there. Now that raises the question of something that arises in these three chapters. Call and choice. And we've misunderstood this so often. Analyze the whole of the Old and the New Testament and you will see that God chooses people for tasks. He does not choose our ultimate destiny. Putting it bluntly, God does not decide who's going to heaven and who's going to hell. That's based on our decisions in response to him. But God chooses us for tasks now, and he chooses what he wants to make us to be if we will let him. You see, we humans were made with free will. We have the right, God has made us that way, to choose to be part of the great plan and purpose of God, or we can choose not to go that way. We are free to make that choice. That's human free will, the thing that marks human beings out from all other life forms. We have this great scope of free will and choice, along with a capacity for creativity. Paul unfolds this, and it's illustrated by the way he's dealt with the Jewish nation. Now with that background, let's move on into the chapter. But before we look at the very end of chapter 9, I want to tie it back to the key messages that Paul has demonstrated from a little bit earlier in chapter 9. In simple terms, what Paul is saying here is that his plans, God's plans, have not failed. We humans rebel, but so often God continues his work, and he does it through a remnant, a small group that are prepared to listen. That's the simple principle that worked in the life of the Jewish nation over the centuries, still works today. And if we're honest, all of us deserve nothing but God's rejection. We are by nature rebellious. We want to do it our way, not God's way. And we do some terrible things to each other as a result. We deserve nothing from God. None of us is good enough to impress God. But God is love, and his purpose is to reach out to humanity. That's you and me. And he does it. I've called it a sovereign act of grace. We don't deserve it. We can't earn it. But it comes to us because God, by nature, is love. His agenda is the best for the creatures he has made, you and me. That's his purpose. And he often reaches humanity through individuals that he chooses for a task, not for a destiny of heaven or hell, a task. Sometimes does it through a people group chosen for a task. And you saw this in chapter 9, where God chose Isaac, not the older brother Ishmael. God chose Jacob, not his slightly older twin brother Esau. Now, that didn't mean that God had destined Ishmael and Esau to an eternal punishment in hell, whatever that may mean. No, Ishmael and Esau were blessed enormously. But God chose Isaac and Jacob for a task. They became the founders of the nation of Israel. God's choice of an individual for a task, it's not based on what we want. In fact, we deserve nothing, none of us. It's based on God's mercy. God looks for somebody through whom he can work, who will respond. And he gives that person a task. Sometimes they rise to the task. Sometimes they fail and reject it. And God alone knows the right task for individuals. We're not clever enough to work it out or challenge it. God has a specific task for you. He made you. He did not make a mistake. He made you for a purpose and a task in this world here and now. And he knows you better than you know yourself, and he knows what's the best thing for you. If we could just listen to him, hear him, and follow it. The important point is this: God's choice is for a task. It's never an eternal destiny. And that couldn't be that way because in the Old Testament era they didn't even have a word in the Hebrew language for hell as we know it today. The Old Testament doesn't deal with that issue. It deals with the here and now, living for God, drawing other people to him, and moving into quality life. But you see, in Paul's day, it was utterly surprising that so many of the Jewish people had rejected the Messiah. Now, we mustn't overemphasize this. There were many Jewish people who came and responded to Jesus and found life and fulfilment in him. But nonetheless, the majority rejected, especially the leadership. And what Paul is doing here, and now I want to move into the last part of the chapter, is he's saying, let's go back to the Old Testament to find an answer. And the answer lies in verse 32. Now we'll come to that just in a moment. When he points out that the Jewish people of Paul's day, and indeed of today, but even more so in Paul's day, they were trying to earn their righteousness by their self-effort. They were trying to impress God by what they could do, by rule-keeping. And in the process, they were driving out a dependence on God. They were driving out a response to God. They were cutting themselves off from it. And that principle still applies today. If you look at the currency of the language of today, the language of religion and cultures throughout the world, where people accept that there is a God, and many do not, most people are trying to earn their righteousness, their favor. They're trying to impress God by self-effort. Doesn't work. None of us are good enough. And in that context, the cross of Jesus is always a stumbling block. You find it a stumbling block today in the political correctness of the West. You find it a stumbling block in the thought forms of the Far East. You find it a stumbling block in the world of Islam. You find it a stumbling block in the remainder of communism. Because when we look at the cross, we have to accept we're not good enough to do it ourselves. Jesus did it for us. Now we have to gulp and say that. It cuts across our arrogance and pride, which is natural in our human rebellion. You see, that's what the cross does. There's no room for pride. There's no room for religious pride. There's no room for self-righteousness. As I record this, it's the month of Ramadan. And I watch my Muslim friends, and there's a real sense of pride and achievement if they can keep the fast, which in a northern country is not easy, because there are very few hours of darkness. You see, the cross comes right against that. Religion produces pride. It produces self-righteousness, self-effort, achievement. I did it. I performed. I completed the ritual. And that's a problem, not just for the Jewish people of Paul's day, but it's a problem for today. So let's look at these verses with that background. Paul writes, "What then shall we say? That the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have obtained it, a righteousness that is by faith. But the people of Israel who pursued the law as the way of righteousness have not attained their goal." They've not been good enough. Why not? Because they pursued it not by faith, but as if it were by works, by self-effort. They stumbled over the stumbling stone, as it is written, "See, I lay in Zion a stone that causes people to stumble, and a rock that causes them to fall, and the one who believes in him will never be put to shame." Now Paul is quoting two passages from Isaiah, which we'll look at just in a moment. Now this passage has a fair number of religious words: righteousness, faith, believe. Let's just remind ourselves what these words actually mean. There's righteousness. Now the way Paul is using that word, it means having the status of being accepted by God. It's the same word that's translated when it's a verb as justify, or a noun, justification, the process. It's a legal word. The law court has declared you not guilty. The state has nothing against you. You're free to go, free to live. It doesn't declare you're perfect. Doesn't declare you've never done anything wrong in your life. But in the eyes of the law, you're not guilty. You're free to go. You're free to live. The state accepts you. Now that's the concept of righteousness. The Gentiles weren't really looking for it. They weren't trying to get it by self-effort. And because of that, when the message of Jesus came, they could respond. But the Jews were trying to do it by self-effort. And they never achieved the standard good enough. So they failed. Now there's the second word. In the original language, it's the same word for believe and faith. The problem is in English, those words have got a carryover of something intellectual. This is not an intellectual word. It means we take God seriously and respond appropriately. It's a word of action, a word of response, not a word of intellect. And so often in our society today, in our religious groups, we get that one wrong as well. Now that's not the same word, but it carries the same idea. The rule book. The Jewish people had turned the Old Testament where God had outlined the kind of lifestyle that was ready, which was appropriate for his people. They turned it into a rule book, and the more rules they kept, the more God would be pleased. They were trying to do it by self-effort, which is what works is really all about. That's the way of religion. Tragically. And it keeps us away from response to Jesus. Now, I said we'd look at these passages. I want just to look at them a moment or two. The first one in Isaiah 4, a bit of the background. Assyria, the great nation, was attacking from the north. And God shows Isaiah that they were going to almost swamp the nation. But they're not going to get it. The land belongs to God. God's still with them. But Isaiah is instructed to tell the people to reject some wrong viewpoints that they're holding. Many of God's people thought that they were God's chosen people. God would protect them against anything. They could do what they like. They could live any way they like. God would never leave them. And they also thought they could win against Assyria, which was a very powerful empire, by their own self-effort. Now, Judah, the land here, was a tiny nation. They had no chance, humanly speaking, against Assyria. They could never win. And what Isaiah was saying was, you've got to trust God in this situation. But the people couldn't do that. It was a stumbling block. They thought they were good enough. And their self-effort could win through. Do you see why Paul quotes that passage? There's the second one. The threats are facing the nation. And with these threats, the ruling class of Judah was seeking to depend on Egypt, the empire to the south. Isaiah says, no, that's the wrong way. The only hope of rescue against the power of Assyria lies in God himself. And Isaiah is speaking of a deliberate unwillingness of the people to listen to what God was saying. Security rests in depending totally on God, not on self-effort, not on other nations, not on structures, not on plans, depending on him. So Paul uses these two illustrations to show exactly the same has happened here. Jesus was a stumbling block to the Jewish people. They'd got the thing to a very refined thought form in the days of Jesus. They focused totally on a kind of rulebook mentality. You could see it in the confrontations that Jesus had with the Pharisees again and again and again. Keep the rules. God will be pleased with you. But in the process, the people of Israel had missed the real means by which acceptance could come. None of us is good enough to keep enough rules to impress God. None of us. It's laughable and an impossibility. God knows that. God knows our weaknesses. And God did for us what we couldn't do for ourselves in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But you see, they never saw Jesus as the end and goal of their searching. And they went on to continue on the fruitless path of self-effort. And sadly, they're still doing that today. And indeed, you can see it in religions, and it's crept into the Christian religion all over the place. The fruitless path of self-effort. And Jesus, represented by the cross, stands right against that. Because when Jesus went to the cross, he was demonstrating to the world, we couldn't do it ourselves, he did it for us. That's the tragic way of religion. And in our culture and society, we're so often dragged into this way in thought form. Must turn up to this meeting, must dress this way, must perform this religious ritual, must do it this correct way, must face this way, must bow this way, must not eat food or drink in this way. The way of religion. It doesn't impress God. Our religious rituals have no meaning for him at all. Read the great prophetic writers of the Old Testament. They hammer it. Read particularly the prophecies of Micah. Now, Paul launches into an expansion of this. He's deeply concerned about Israel. He was himself from a Jewish background. He came from a Pharisaical background. He kept the law religiously till he found when he met Jesus didn't work. That's the key verse. That's the problem with religion. They did not know the righteousness of God, the way God works. They sought to establish their own righteousness by self-effort. They did not submit to God's righteousness. All that God has done for us in Jesus. And that summarizes the central place of Jesus. He is the culmination. Now, that's a very good translation. It captures the meaning of the original word beautifully. The culmination of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. And then he launches into a whole series of quotations from the Old Testament. These chapters contain a greater density of Old Testament quotations than anywhere else in Paul's writing. Paul is seeking to demonstrate this is not new. He has not invented it. It runs right throughout the Old Testament. And we'll look at some of these in a moment or two. That's a very shaking text. Paul says, I can testify about them, that's the Jews, but it could be about us, that they are zealous for God. Indeed they are. But their zeal is not based on knowledge. Now you can look at people from all religions, and that's true. If you look at the word knowledge there, this carries the idea of a kind of intelligent ordering, making sense of that which comes to our senses, that which is based on evidence. Enormous amount of religions are just simply assertions. They're often shrouded in religious texts, or they're dogmatically stated by religious leaders. But when you come down to it, they're just simply assertions. Where is the knowledge? Where is the evidence? Where have we used our brains to work it out and look at things and weigh things up? Where is the truth? You see, sincerity is not enough. Evidence is critical. God does not want us to believe things blindly. In fact, God does not ask us to believe things that are downright stupid. And in all religions, there's plenty of that. That's a misuse of the concept of faith. When people say, my faith will not allow me to believe, that's not what the word faith means. Faith is a response to what God is saying and doing. And too often in our religion, we just make things up. Now I'm challenging you, I'm hitting this hard, I'm challenging you to look at the things that are important in your lives. Examine them, not in the light of what I'm saying, but in the light of what the Bible actually teaches. Look at them in the light of what life shows us, the evidence of life. Evidence is critical. And the Jewish people then, they didn't understand God's way of working. God works by a way of righteousness. He puts things right His way. He accepts us His way. But the Jewish people tried to win God's favor, establishing their own righteousness by their own self-effort and law-keeping. And they kind of lost the way. They couldn't see what God was doing. And again, I stress this. None of us is good enough to do this. And it's laughable to think that we can. That is such a central verse. Christ, the Lord Jesus Christ, is the culmination of the law. He came to fulfill the law. It's what he said in Matthew. So that there may be righteousness, acceptance by God. For everyone who believes, that's people who respond to God, who take God seriously and act accordingly. That summarizes and brings it all together so beautifully. He is the answer. He holds the answer. In himself, he is completely the answer. He fulfills all the patterns of God's working. And he did it through his perfect life. And he did it through his suffering love on a cross. What a wonderful and beautiful picture. Takes the pressure off us. But it dethrones human pride when we think we can impress God. For the Jews, there was a kind of sequence, a logical progression. God had showed his way of doing things. Someone described it that way: actions by which God brings people into right relationship with himself. We're not good enough to achieve that. God offers it to us if we do it his way. Jesus comes to us. He invites us into the kingdom of God. There are no entry conditions but a willingness to enter. And in entering we say, I'm not going to run my life my way. I want to live my life the way of Jesus. We respond to what God is saying. But that's what was done so often. That's what the Jewish people were doing at the time. That's what religious people today are doing. Trying to win God's acceptance by rule keeping. You see, in that, seeking to keep the rules is a kind of religious inoculation. An inoculation, something that's partly right but dead and inactive, is put into our bodies, and our bodies build up a resistance to the real thing. And by trying to do the rule keeping, we get a kind of inoculation. We're resistance, we're blinded, we can't see what God had done and was doing in Jesus. And that's how religion works. That's why Satan has created religions, because it blinds people. It's a religious inoculation to reality. And I bring back that verse again. Now at that point, Paul starts a whole series of quotations which we're going to look at very, very briefly. Quotations from the Old Testament to show that there's nothing new in this. There are 12 of them. And this is Paul illustrating the way God has always worked. A whole series of slants and shafts of light from the Old Testament to show this is the way it happens. From Leviticus. The point of the law that God gave was that blessing follows obedience. It's a set of guidelines for living. Then he talks about righteousness coming by faith. Then he quotes, but it's separated off a little bit, 3 verses from Deuteronomy. Moses was speaking to the people. And he points out, I've given you the instructions for right living. This will give you prosperity, fulfillment. I've left you the instructions. They're accessible to all. God doesn't make us unaware of what he wants. Jesus has made it aware to us. And then Paul leads into a quotation from Isaiah 28. God has promises. The call for us all is to trust him, not depend on false sources of help. Whether in the days of Isaiah it was the help that could come from the empire of Egypt, or self-effort. No, the call is to see he's done it for us. That's his offer. And we're all on the same boat. We can be rescued when we depend on him, not by our self-effort. Let's move on. Summarizing some of that, God gave the people of Israel the law, the rule book, the law code, as a guidance and a structure. This is the kind of life you've to live as God's people. Not to impress me, but because it will make your life good. Here was a desert rabble of former slaves who'd come out of Egypt. They'd wandered across the Sinai Peninsula. They were not huge in number, they were coming into our land. What sort of lifestyle was to be there? The people who lived in the land had a dreadful lifestyle. There's no model to work from. Here is the pattern of living. And if you live this way, you'll have a great life. That's the purpose of the law code. That's why God gave the directions. And God makes it completely clear. God always does. It was never given so that people could say, I do this, this, and this, and therefore God will be pleased. They were given for our benefit. Not a code book. Not a rule book. And because God has made things abundantly clear, we know. Now God made things abundantly clear to the Jewish people. It's written in the Old Testament. They had altered their understanding. Then they refused to accept Jesus. They have no excuse. It's abundantly clear. That's the central problem. And that's the central problem with humanity today. We think we can run our lives our way. And then religion comes along and gives us a code book, a rule book, and says, do enough of this, God will be impressed. And we're inoculated against the reality of God's way. Paul speaks about the word of faith he's proclaiming. It comes in two ways: a verbal confession of Jesus and a personal belief. Right into our bones, we know that Jesus is alive and that one day we will rise with him. A deep statement, profession, is the outward manifestation of critical response. These professions merely reveal what's within us. We have responded. We've heard what God has said and what God is doing. We've responded appropriately. We've responded, an outward manifestation. You see, the word belief is not an intellectual word in the original languages. It speaks of life commitment, a response. It is not intellectual assent. It has nothing to do with believe A, B, C, sign here and you're in. It means listening to God, responding appropriately. Look at the life of Abraham. And confessing with the mouth speaks of a lifestyle expression. It's not a kind of private knowledge. It's something that affects our whole life, our whole being. And in this picture, Paul has captured a deep, deep meaning and significance for us. Now, there's some more of the quotations. I put them all up at once. Let me just take them one at a time. The Isaiah 52. We're familiar with these words. I've put in the whole quotation. Paul selects bits of it in Romans chapter 10. If I was to put in a kind of interpretation, what Isaiah is picturing is it's an imagery. It's a metaphor. A runner coming to Jerusalem with the good news of the battle won. The people can now be set free. And in the days of Isaiah, hemmed in by empires all around that were seeking to bring the nation down, the nation of Judah was at risk. That's a picture of what Jesus did on the cross. We can now be set free. Let's move into the next chapter of Isaiah. That wonderful picture, that wonderful good news, you just carry that imagery in mind because that's what Isaiah is picturing. And Isaiah warns that most won't respond. Chapters 52 and 53 speak specifically about the coming of the Messiah. The suffering servant is the language that Isaiah uses. Beautiful picture. Wonderful insight. Isaiah warns most won't respond. They won't respond to that good news. They'll think they have to keep on fighting the battles themselves by their own self-effort. Into the Psalms. The evidence is all over the place. God doesn't leave us ignorant. We don't have to assert and speculate. The evidence is there. Look at the life, death, and resurrection for Jesus. Look at the evidence for his death. It is incontrovertible. Look at the evidence for his resurrection. It is enormous. Look at the evidence that's come from the way of the followers of Jesus into Deuteronomy. The tragedy was that the people of Israel, down through their history, they persisted in rebelling. And in the end of the day, in Deuteronomy, the writer shows that other nations will eventually show them up for what they're doing. And this is what was happening in the first century, in the context that Paul was writing in. People outside Israel were responding in greater numbers than the Jews. And then towards the end of Isaiah, the cry of God, the anguished cry of God, if I say it reverently. God is seeking humanity, is seeking his people to respond. But they are so obstinate, they keep rebelling. They prefer not to listen to God. We prefer to go our own way. And other people are often coming in and responding. If you look at societies today, you'll find that is still true today. There's a pattern here which just keeps repeating itself. And what Paul is showing through this accumulation of Old Testament texts is here. There's patterns, there's principles, there's things that keep on repeating themselves. Tragic. And then Paul speaks about someone sent to share the facts and the evidence. Jesus was sent to tell the Jews. And the facts and the evidence were communicated clearly. Look at the teaching of Jesus, the master teacher. He made it known. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. You're welcome in. Come on in. The door is open. There are no entry conditions, but you want to enter. God's going to do it for you. He's going to do it through all I am going to do as the suffering servant. The people of the days of Jesus certainly heard. And indeed, Paul was part of that after the life of Jesus in making the message known. But it requires us human beings to make a response. Taking what God says seriously, looking at the evidence, the facts, not the opinions, not the assertions, the facts, the evidence, and responding accordingly. And the tragedy was that Paul observed a large majority of the Jews failed to respond. They had been religiously inoculated by all their self-effort, determination. Still happening today across religions. I want to finish this presentation by rather a deep thought, and I'll leave you this to ponder this. Go back and read chapter 10, look at it again, ponder this great messages through. The identity of God's people. Now let's think of the Jewish nation. The identity of God's people was characterized by four things. They had kingship, pictured in the ideal King David. They had a legal system. There were principles of life given so that people could live a rich and full life. They had a temple worship where the worship of God was centralized and organized and God's nature could be seen. And they'd been given a land by God that they did not deserve as a secure base to reach out to the world. Now they lost all that. 587, they went into exile in Babylon. 70 years of exile before they were restored back to their land. But only a minority came back. A remnant is the biblical word. When people started to realize what they'd done, the mistakes they'd made, the misunderstandings, but a minority came back. And they started to rebuild what they'd got. But one box, one circle is empty. They got the land back, or at least part of it. They started to rebuild the temple. Ezra led them in restoring the laws, which was the principles, the guidance of quality living, living that made life rich and good. But they never got their king back. And in the days when Jesus came, the people of Israel were living in the land. Tragically, they turned the law code into a rule book to try and impress God. The temple had been reduced to a commercial enterprise. And the land was overrun and basically ruled by the Romans, and they were longing for the Romans to be thrown out. All sorts of puppet kings they had, but they didn't have a real king. And when Jesus came, he came to give them it all back. He was the fulfilment of Israel, its destiny and its purpose under God, to make God known to the world. When Jesus came, he was the king forever from David's line. You'll see that traced right throughout the Bible. Jesus came to enable us to have quality living. Not by self-effort to impress God, but quality living to make our lives good, rich, for ourselves and for each other. You see, in this world, each of us is here to bring benefit to others, those around. And when we start to think that way, which is the Jesus way, life becomes really wonderful. Oh, what a glorious picture. Jesus is the temple of God. Look at John's Gospel near the start. Rebuild the temple. He was speaking of his own body. He is the center of bringing us to God, the place of worship. He opened the door. He opened the door to the kingdom. You're welcome in. There is no need for a temple ever to be rebuilt. And there's no need for a physical land, because Jesus gives the territory. He gives us complete security, a secure base from which we can reach out to touch and bless other people round about, simply by the quality of our living. Because if we live for the benefit of other people, we touch lives all the time and bring benefit to them. And we're living the way of Jesus. From the secure base of knowing that we're accounted righteous before God, not because we've earned it, not because we deserve it, but because Jesus gave it to us through all he did in his life, death, and resurrection. Oh, what a glorious and beautiful picture. Ponder this through. Read the chapter again. And the next presentation we'll move on and we'll look at something of how it works out. Just bringing it to a summary. If you look at the book of Isaiah, Isaiah pictures the ideal kingship coming in a Messiah, the suffering servant. When Jesus came, he was the everlasting king, descended from the line of David, exactly as the Old Testament predicted. The laws of God were God's outline of the lifestyle for his people, to make life rich and good, so that we could live for each other. What Jesus came to do is fulfill that and make it possible for us to live this way. He gives us the resources. That's why he gave us the Holy Spirit. The center of response to God is in our sacrificial devotion. Jesus is the center. He's the center of our lives. When we allow our lives, we take a decision. I want to live the way of Jesus. We want him to be the center of our lives. We ask the help of the Holy Spirit to make it possible. That's our worship. That's our devotion. That's God's purpose for us. The land was given to the people of Israel as a secure base so they could reach out to others. Strategically located in the joint between Europe, Asia, and Africa. We don't need a land now. Neither do the Jews. Because Jesus is our security. And from that secure base, we can live our lives, the ordinary things of life, just touching lives round about, living for the best for others, and reaching out to them in the process. What a lovely picture. And with that thought in mind, we'll move in the next presentation to look at the final of the 3 chapters where Paul addresses the Jewish question.